Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Better Board's live webinar on Indigenous Governance Excellence. I would like to introduce today's speaker, Jessica Bulger. Jess is the CEO of the Australian Indigenous Governance Institute, serves as a co-chair on the board of Outward Bound Australia, and as the external co-chair for GHD's RAP Advisory Group. Jess began her career as a teacher and has worked in education, employment, and the NFP sector for the past 15 years. She is passionate about Indigenous governance, leadership and capacity building, and seeing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and communities thrive. At the conclusion of today's webinar, you'll be asked to kindly complete a short feedback form, which will be distributed as a pop-up window on your screen. A copy of the presentation will also be posted in the chat at the conclusion. You will have access to a recording of this webinar via the link you used to register or log in, and that will be available after the event has finished. Questions may be answered both during the presentation and at the end, so please type them in when they come to mind using the questions icon, not the chat. Now, without further ado, please welcome Jess to the stage.
Thanks so much, Kelly. Hello, everyone. I will start by acknowledging country, and it's a little bit different today. You'll notice I'm in a hotel room. I'm actually in Fiji, and while that's known as a holiday destination, I'm going to have 2 days of holiday, but for the front half of this week, I've been here for a work commitment, which I'd love to share a little bit more about as part of acknowledging country. And what I've been doing here this week, I'm on a steering committee for a program that is funded by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and it's a women's leadership program. What it does is works with women from the Pacific, so places like Fiji, but also Tonga, Samoa, Solomon Islands, Tuvalu, Kiribati, and works with women who apply for scholarships and different pieces of funding. It's all about community. It's about advancing the leadership profile and capacity of those ladies through studying, but also through community projects. So I've had the pleasure of being on a bus and around some villages in the last couple of days with colleagues from DFAT and steering committee colleagues from some of those countries I just mentioned, to visit these projects that are that are successful, that are the product of that leadership, or a leadership fund for the women who are scholars in the program to as community development. So we visited a poultry farm that's a new model in a village, a sustainable way of enhancing economic participation and being sort of produce being grown in community. Some really interesting things. I've also I'll sort of be honest and open, and when we talk about leadership and we talk about governance, it's all connected. Being over here as part of a women's leadership program, I also took the opportunity to bring my 4-month-old baby, my husband, and my 5-year-old. So they've been kicked out, and I'm here to speak with you. So I'd like to, as we do in Australia, pay respects to the elders of this land and thank them for their ongoing care of country and their leadership and the lessons that I've been able to share and learn this week. It's just so amazing when you sit with other First Nations women. So much is the same. A little bit is different, of course, but there are so many principles and values that we hold the same, and it's just so lovely to connect. It's good for the soul. Anyway, I'll also say then, I'll say Bula and Vinaka, hello and thank you. And then also in my language, Wiradjuri, I say Yirdumarang Mujigalang, which is G'day friends, and Mandangu, thank you for having me. While I'm doing language, I want to just mention that's the little bit of tiny fine print you see up there at the top of the slide. Don't worry about trying to read that. It's there as a note of respect to language, in that the terms that we use, they come in and out of preference. And I just wanted to make sure that, because we use the term Indigenous here at AIGI, we're using that term to reference the body of research around Indigenous governance that also is connected to international Indigenous governance research. We also use that term because it encompasses Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. I myself prefer to use Aboriginal. I am Aboriginal, I am Wiradjuri, but I understand that different parts of Australia, in particular, will have, and of course, we're starting to use First Nations more frequently, and that's a language preferences evolve. So that's sort of it comes in and out. So I just wanted to acknowledge that if I use a term that doesn't sit right with you, I apologise. I mean no disrespect. It's part of this work that we do, in that things can sometimes be a little bit tricky. So we just have to acknowledge that and come as a friend and an advocate, and with respect, and work together for all of these things that we care about that are common. Anyway, I'm going to get into the content in a moment. I just wanted to give a few more of those sort of opening remarks, and also acknowledge that it's Reconciliation Week. The theme is now more than ever, and to reflect that we're seeing a shifting narrative. There is, and of course I choose to be positive and optimistic. You have to, but I'm really seeing the narrative shifting in Australia, and growth in terms of seeing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders and Indigenous knowledge as intellectual equals, and acknowledging that we have governed ourselves since time immemorial. We have looked after the environment forever. There is knowledge there to be valued, and value can be shared, power can be shared. So the work that we do at AIGI, I'll talk a little bit more about in detail, but just to sort of start off with saying that in Reconciliation Week, now more than ever, this work that we do together to share value, to shift power, to advance that narrative toward respecting and acknowledging Indigenous people and knowledges is very, very important, and we make particular note of it during Reconciliation Week. Of course, not to skim over the fact that for many Australians, there's a real moment of soul searching and deep thinking during this Reconciliation Week in a post-no Australia, where many of my community and colleagues will be not comfortable with this optimism and reconciliation that we have had in years past. That there's a discomfort this week, and many of us are being very careful and thoughtful about how we engage, and engaging very differently. So if that is you, to acknowledge that and respect that, it's challenging for sure. All right. Also, the really strange thing about when you do these sorts of webinars is I can't see you, and I don't know even how many of you there are. I don't know where you're from. I don't know what you care about. So if you're open to it, and I'll sort of try and keep an eye on it as I go, if you're open to it, you're welcome to share where you're from and which organisation or industry. If you don't want to share the organisation, maybe you want to share industry that you're from. I will generally, talk to a really broad audience on these topics, but also, if I note some organisations there that I know and sort of have a familiarity with, then I can share some examples, or that might be a little bit more specific as well. So it's always helpful to know. If you're comfortable doing it, that's great. If not, that's fine too. So we've got an hour together, and what I'm going to do with that time is I've spent a little bit of time in sort of introductory remarks. I'm going to show a video in a little while as well that is about Indigenous governance and two-way governance. I'm then going to spend a bit of time. I've sort of broken it into, 4 blocks in my mind. Introductory remarks, video. We're then going to go into what is two-way governance, what is Indigenous governance, or First Nations governance, if you prefer that term, and we'll sort of talk and unpack terminology as we go as well. And then I want to do a little bit in sort of the third block of time there. What I want to do is talk to you about how you could apply principles of Indigenous governance to your work, to your organisations, to what you do every day, and then leave some time for questions at the end. That's my goal. All right. I mentioned a little bit of an introduction before. I always throw this up for context, particularly for other other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the call. I'm from Tumut, which is a little country town in New South Wales. I'm Wiradjuri. I grew up in a big, proud Aboriginal family, lucky to be connected to culture and community, with family very involved in community governance. I tell a funny story. I don't want to sort of talk too much about myself. I want to share the work of AIGI with you, but to share a story in terms of who I'm from and where I come from. As a kid, and I remember small country town, trades, very big, sort of the big industry is a lot of kids going to trade. There were these trucks that would drive around, like utes that would drive around town, that said A. Murray and Sons, and Murray as in like Murray, the fellow's surname. But what's really interesting about, and when I say that, I made that joke in Brisbane last week, and everyone went, "Oh, Murray," and oh no, that's funny, but that's actually not the joke. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that, as a kid, I'd see these trucks drive around and I go, "Oh, that must be nice," These white fellas with businesses to pass on. Look at that intergeneration. Not that you know these words as a kid, but you think, "Oh, don't have to worry about that stress of school and uni and getting marks, getting the qualification, set yourself up." These mob have got businesses to pass on. Wouldn't it be nice to have that intergenerational security and wealth? What I realise as I get older and I build my career is that, and have a chance to have an impact that I want to have for our people, that, well, in fact, my intergenerational wealth has been principles of effective community governance and seeing magnificent eldership, being witness to magnificent eldership. That is my intergenerational wealth. And, while I continue to be worthy and do a good job and treasure those moments where I'm asked to be a sounding board for an auntie who's running our land council, or, on a particular board and has something that, she might like my input on, what's happening there is that's the intergenerational wealth and healing being passed on to me. It's not just about owning a car and a boat. In fact, for us, and I think I can make a generalisation that would be true for many, many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, that we see intergenerational wealth and health and healing differently to the broader environment. So I just thought I'd make that point in terms of who I am and what I care about. I wanted to go into deeper the work of AIGI, Indigenous Governance Institute, and just tell you a little bit of the origin story. This is a big slide, lots of info on it. You get this set of slides afterwards. So sometimes I design a slide because somebody might read it back, so there's more information on there than I might put on there if I was sort of speaking at a conference or something like that. But I wanted to share the story in that AIGI, our history starts almost 25 years ago. We are actually 12 years old formally, but the story goes back to the early 2000s. And at the time, if you think about the reconciliation movements, just over 20 years old, there was a group of some of the members of the RA board at the time, but also some other influential folks working within SBA and other relevant organisations, were part of a community development. I just see I have a Fijian wife. Hello there, John. Nice to see you. Yeah, it's beautiful here today. I'm very grateful to been on this trip for sure. The other thing, it's just a complete aside, what I notice about Fijian culture also is that they just love babies. We were at a village earlier in the week, and my 4-month-old was scooped up and taken off for all the aunties to have a cuddle of. And my colleagues at DFAT said, "Oh, does that freak you out a little bit?" And I said, no. It's quite common, his aunties do that to him at home too. And I think, gosh, where's he gone? Anyway, to go back to the story, sorry to digress. The story of AIGI, we're part of a research project that looked into what is significant and unique about Indigenous organisations that are successful, and we're able to ascertain through that research project that, in fact, the way that we organise ourselves, and when I say we, I hope that's okay to use that term we broadly, I mean we as in First Nations people of Australia. The way that we organise ourselves is different to the broader governance environment. That's the definition of governance, a group of people organising themselves towards a shared goal. So for us, the way that we organise ourselves, it's different, connected to reconciliation work and leadership work, and very important and complementary, but constituted its own, the need for its own institute, and so started AIGI in 2012, in those early days, auspiced by both RA and SVA. The organisation exists, though, to strengthen governance with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations and communities. Those are our strategic priorities: to build the resources, to strengthen capability, to strike the right partnerships, and to be an organisation that is sustainable. What we do more practically is we look after the Indigenous Governance Toolkit, a gigantic web resource with all sorts of downloadable videos, stories, worksheets, resources that can help organisations in a bit of a self-service mode. We also deliver the Indigenous Governance Awards with Reconciliation Australia. We do some advocacy in the formal, serious sense, like writing submissions and trying to get in front of the right politicians to advance what we've learned to be important, but also this soft advocacy sort of stuff, which is telling the story of Indigenous governance to the broader environment, and continuing to tell that story. We also do professional development and advisory work, so we go out and deliver professional development, and we have more recently been building our emerging directors program, which is about classroom learning, of course, but it's also about coaching and mentoring. We are a not-for-profit. We're also a not-for-loss. I say that often, in that a very lean not-for-profit with well-managed finances is very important. We're a non-government organisation. We're heavily reliant on philanthropic funding, although doing some very good work recently to build our own source revenue, and not really the topic of today in terms of the sustainability of AIGI and the not-for-profit sector, but I'll talk a little bit about that as we go. It'll probably come up. But that's who we are as AIGI, and what we really care about is, as I said, building those resources to strengthen governance. And of course, we all know, for my Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander brothers and sisters on the call, we know that when we have control and ownership of the things that impact our lives, when we have strong organisations, strong communities, everything else works better. That's what it's all about, is building strong governance in order to see communities thrive. I'll go into a little bit more of Indigenous governance and share a few quotes and diagrams and that sort of thing. But before I do that, I was going to ask Kelly if we could play a video. What you're going to see is a 4-minute video. The sound's a little bit loud at the beginning, so if that bothers you, just adjust your own audio. I apologise. But what it is, it's a video of Indigenous Governance Awards finalists talking about two-way governance and what that means to them. Go ahead, Kelly.
We have, in my perspective, we have two bosses. We are regulated under the National Health and Medical Research Council guidelines, but then we also have a responsibility to our members and our community. So there's a balance that we have to try and maintain when assessing applications and ensuring that both sets of expectations are being fulfilled.
Who we're answerable to as an organisation, ultimately we're answerable to our community, and then our community, our board represents our community, and then that's how decisions get made within our organisation. It always comes from that heart of what do our community need and what are they saying they need, and how do we deliver our organisation in a way that is ultimately of benefit to our community.
Who we answer to and who we're accountable to. Obviously, there is the ORIC side of things. Like, obviously, We have reporting schedules that we have to keep with ORIC. There are reporting schedules that we have to keep with the ACC now that we are a registered charity. But mainly for us, I know at the end of the day, I live in this community. I live in the surfing community, the Indigenous surfing community. I know for me, my accountability in terms of Nauru Guru Groms and Nauru Indigenous Corporation in this community.
So we really work closely with the committee members, the Secretariat and the researchers across this state to make sure that the research is culturally safe and of benefit to our mob.
But I think the fact perhaps that we're doing it the Aboriginal way, you know, that's our main aim, is to do it, and they call it the Wonga, now I'm going to say it wrong, Wonga way. And I think that's what they're aiming for. And if I can go back a long time ago when this first started, it was walking together with the Aboriginal community plus the people at the Alcohol and Drug Authority who assisted us, the Aboriginal division, to work and do what was required. So it was walking together right from the beginning. It's still walking together now.
Obviously the CEO stability in his term being here must be seen as a positive for the community and I guess stakeholders involved in this sort of a service, and there must be many alcohol and drug services. I mean, there must be some good relationships and good understanding about what Wangaling does. And I think the faith that government will have in such a service because of their stability is important.
Oh, I'm biased, but this is best organisation that I've ever worked for, and it's the best job I've ever had. I love working for the community, with the community, for the community, and being at my community as well. It just makes it even better. Love it.
Thank you. I hope that that was, the sound worked well at your end. I heard it just fine. So if it was a bit loud at the beginning, apologise for that. It's just that music at the beginning is a bit loud. Anyway, what that video illustrates, I hope, for you as well, is it's just a really good example of folks talking about who they are accountable to. And I wanted to use that video to set up the next part that we'll talk about. I will give a pretty theoretical, I suppose, definition of two-way accountability as a baseline for our conversation. I often, will give that definition, and many people that we've worked with, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, will say, I've never heard it put like that, but of course, I spoke last week up in Brisbane at the First Nations Women in Leadership conference, and I said, are you on put your hand up if you're on a board or a committee. Put your hand up if that organisation or committee you're on is led by non-Indigenous people. And, for those that have said yes, what do you have a feeling of? Do you ever have that feeling of, I'm trying to explain something here. I'm doing a bit of the educating. I'm taking a breath. I'm doing a bit more of that educating and awareness building, and it's tricky. And you get this resounding, yeah. It's because what's really happening there is that for Indigenous people and organisations, what we are doing is balancing two forms of accountability. And that's really what I wanted to talk about today. Before we go into two-way governance, I wanted to establish what we're talking about when we say Indigenous governance. You can change that term to Aboriginal governance or to First Nations governance. Generally, the definition is intended to be broad, but this is a quote from Mick Gooder, who at the time was the Social Justice Commissioner, who says, while Indigenous peoples have governed ourselves since time immemorial in accordance with our traditional laws and customs, when we talk about Indigenous governance, we're not referring to the pre-colonial state. What we mean is contemporary Indigenous governance, the recent melding of traditional governance with the requirement to effectively respond to the wider governance environment. There's this quote also that I really want to share. And again, it's lots of words on a page. Don't worry about trying to read it right now. I'll read bits of it, but it's so that, I put lots of words there so that it's a resource that might be useful later. It's a piece of writing by Irene Watson from Uni SA. She's a magnificent woman. Go and find this, read the whole thing if you're interested. It's called "The Future Is Our Past," and what it does is it talks about the existence of treaties pre-contact. And of course, we have this history of peaceful coexistence that's evidenced by 200 or more Aboriginal languages in existence. That tells us that agreements existed. That tells us that there were mutual respect shared, that all of these shared spaces or exclusive spaces, gendered spaces, all of that organisation, that is governance. That is evidence of Indigenous governance in place pre-contact. And the journey that we have been on in the last 250 years in order to establish contemporary Indigenous governance, that is governance that is culturally and community informed by the priorities and culture and values of the community that organisation serves, that is contemporary Indigenous governance. So I wanted to use the words of those magnificent individuals, Irene Watson and Mick Gooder, to establish that definition. And to now talk about two-way governance. As I mentioned before, what we know is that, and the evidence shows from almost 20 years of research, the evidence shows that organisations are most successful when they can balance these two forms of accountability. Of course, we're talking about the wider governance environment. So, if you are an organisation who is registered under the CATSI Act, we know that term, the Corporations Act, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, or you might not be. You might be registered under the Corporations Act. You answer to a regulator, whether that's ORIC or ASIC. Maybe you're a charity also, whether that's ACNC. If you're an AMS, you'll have different medical accreditations, legislation, regulators, compliance accreditation. All of those sorts of things, that wider governance environment, the system settings that we operate in, all of that is very important and very necessary to learn and to upskill ourselves in, but not to move away from the fact that for our organisations, there are priorities, there's culture, there's goals, there's what matters to that community that you exist for. I've just popped some examples there that resonate with my experience. It could be different things, of course, but it might be things like looking after country, passing on knowledge, language reclamation work. It might be a broad phrase, of course. There we could go more specific, but strong future for the kids. Those are the things that might matter to a particular community or nation, Indigenous nation. What we do as Indigenous organisations and individuals is we navigate life under our laws and non-Indigenous laws, and that requires consideration, collaboration, compromise. What we need to understand as well is that our governance, it's fluid, it's adaptive, and it requires this navigation of our cultural needs in Western models on our country. And balancing that, it's difficult, it's tricky. That's why so much work is happening in this space. That's why we have so much work that we are doing and talking to different organisations all the time about really varying needs, talking to government, trying to tell that story of, hey, this is difficult, but gosh, it's so important, because when it is successful, when we have powerful organisations and effective organisations, the impact for communities is really special. So it's important work to be doing, but it's difficult. At AIGI, we talk about principles of effective Indigenous governance, and those are termed as customised, culturally legitimate, two-way accountable, and evolving. And I'll talk a little bit more about those. This diagram illustrates that the point I made there before, it's in the blue box at the top here of this one, is that organisations are most successful when there's a balance of those forms of accountability and when Indigenous governance principles are in place to do that balancing act in the middle. To talk more about those principles, when we talk about customised, what we're talking about is customising the governance model for the specific purpose, environment, and resources in what you have available to you. And remember, the definition of governance is the way that a group organises themselves towards a shared goal. So that's the governance model, is how you organise yourselves. Indigenous organisations that are doing well, they organise themselves in a way that is customised to the purpose of the organisation, to the priorities of that organisation, to the ways, if we look at culturally legitimate, to the ways, to that nation's way of doing things. And I'll give you some examples in just a moment. We also talk about evolving as an effective, as part of effective Indigenous governance, in that your governance model, again, the way you organise yourself toward a shared goal, it adapts over time to match changes. It's also about that accountability, two-way accountability, and that people who the governance serves, that organisation or community serves, they have a say in the design. There's a little typo there, I apologise. They have a say in the design and the priorities and the strategy. And there'll be various different ways that organisations do this accountability. At AIGI in particular, we are sort of a peak. We don't have a big membership like you might know of a traditional peak, but the way that we involve the audience that we want to work with and the community that we care about is that when we conduct our evaluations, we invite a cross-section of that network to give feedback on our work and our impact, so that goes into our next strategy, and that goes back to the places that we receive funding from, so that we have that mechanism for the community to have a say in what we're doing. If you're sitting there thinking, oh, I'm part of this organisation, gosh, how do we do that accountability? Various things will be jumping to mind, and you might have good examples, and you might have examples where you go, oh, gee, we could do a little bit more. So talking through, the point of having principles is, if you have principles, it allows you to think about, okay, do we do that? How well do we do that? If we strive to put these principles in place in order to ensure our success, we can then craft a bit of a health check or self-assessment, whatever term you want to use. We can craft a bit of a self-assessment from those principles. So we run workshops all the time where we'll sit with a board and we'll say, okay, let's talk about how well you are implementing these principles, and not in a deficit way, but in a strengths-based way, to say, okay, how are you doing these things well, and where are the areas that you can shift your strategy to include more ways to implement these principles, because that the research and the experience shows that when these principles are in place, organisations are able to effectively balance accountability and be successful both with the wider governance environment and also in serving those that the organisation exists for. I want to talk about Purple House. Some of you might know the organisation. It's the organisation based in Alice Springs that's focused on getting dialysis to people who need it in remote communities. And to give a really specific example of cultural values and priorities and needs of the community being embedded into the way that the organisation does things. These are the values of Purple House, and I've highlighted the two that I want to focus on. They say in their values, we will be strong, clever, brave, and determined to make life better for our people. We will think deeply, plan wisely, and take action to support patient agency, enhance well-being, and maintain dignity. And so those are the values of the organisation that they've taken by working with, that they've come to by working with their community, the people that they serve. They've then embedded that into the way they make decisions. So in really, really specific ways, in that what they do is their meetings go over 2 days to give enough time to present the information so that directors have time to reflect before making decisions. If I take you back to the principles, to the values just here before, that is them acting on that value of thinking deeply and planning wisely. It's a really simple way of saying, well, hang on, what matters here? What matters to the people that we exist for? How can we build that into the way that we make decisions and the way we share information? Also really important in that they make a point of attending the board meetings of other organisations and keeping the sources of information really current on the website, their Facebook page, and so that they share information in a way that is related to those values that they have set with those that they serve. I've spoken to you for about 35 minutes now, and I apologise, it's not very interactive, but what I wanted to do is see if we can be a little bit more interactive. Well, in that I don't know that you can't really talk to me, but what I'm going to do is sort of give you some reflection exercises, and I'll try and sort of pause a little bit so that you're not listening to me constantly while you're trying to think as well. I wanted to talk a little bit to you about transforming the system settings, but I'm going to change the order of doing things here. I'll come back to this slide. It's not fit in the end where I wanted it to. I'll go to this instead. I was talking before about effective Indigenous governance, and this is a complex little diagram with some arrows and the strength emoji there. But let me talk you through it. So we're aware, of course, that the ongoing impacts of colonisation, this dominant force of Western governance, what that does is that pushes down onto that wider governance environment. It's ongoing. It sets this. It makes it so difficult to transform that system because it's existed for a long time. The issues are structural. It's not about individuals. The issues are structural. When we have strong community governance, that destabilizes the status quo, and it demands listening, and it demands Western models doing more of the bridge, the building the bridge and doing that coming to the middle ground to listen and adapt and be respectful of cultural knowledge and cultural practice. So when we have effective governance as Indigenous organisations, that is an act of disruption and an act of self-determination. And what that does is that forces better partnership, better giving, better practices from Western models. But then we want to ask the question of, well, what can Western models learn from Indigenous governance? And for my Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander brothers and sisters on the call, you'll know that our community-controlled organisations, they have exceptional governance because they are naturally accountable to community. And so that precedent is already there. To speak a bit more in a Western sort of way of putting things, Indigenous governance, it's engaged and stakeholder responsive governance. That's a term you'd hear from a big governance organisation in the mainstream, if I can use that term, is that Indigenous governance is actually very stakeholder responsive. And so then what can Western models learn from Indigenous governance? I think a great deal. I think a lot. And it's not just about, learning from Indigenous ways of knowing, being and doing in order to create better partnerships. But in fact, what we're trying to do is create an Australian governance model that serves the community better, that serves to create a governance, an Australian governance model that we can all be proud of. There's a quote that I love that I always share, and it's interesting. The quote is attributed to Lilla Watson, an activist from Queensland. Although I don't, it's anyway. We're so humble, and it's attributed to her. But she said, no, that's the group. When you sort of look it up. But anyway, the quote is a little bit like, I don't have it written down in front of me, but I'll share the intent is that if you've come here to help me, then I'm not interested. But if you've worked out that your liberation is connected to mine, then let us work together. So it's not about, what I was talking about before is shifting the narrative, shifting power, really moving forward into this the world that we live in today. It's not about helping mob. It's not about, oh my gosh, they need help. They're hopeless. Let's create support programs. It's about, hang on a minute. We're smart. We know what we're doing. We've been governing ourselves since forever. We have something to share. It's smart for everybody to build a governance model in this nation that we can all be proud of, but that better serves everybody. And so the message that I want to share when we share the work of AIGI is to consider, what can Western models learn from Indigenous governance? And so the next couple of slides here, again, lots of words on a page, but thinking of it in terms of something you'll take away later. The point of this is to go, well, hang on a minute. If you are, and I see some of the organisations listed over here, if you think about the organisations that you're part of, I'm just looking here, such a variety here, some Indigenous organisations, some that work with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations, such a variety there. What I want to put to you today is to apply these principles to your context. And so, and I mentioned before this idea of a self-assessment or health check, to try and put these principles in place. We run this workshop with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations, and we ask the questions: does culture play an important role in how the organisation functions? Does the organisation seek input and guidance from elders or traditional knowledge holders in decision-making processes? And you can sort of sit around as a board and go, let's, give ourselves a 4 out of 5 on that, or, choose 2 or 3 of these things that we might put on our governance action plan for the things that we'll work on in the next couple of years. We're good at that, but we could be better. And this is, of course, directed directly at an Indigenous organisation. But if you are part of an organisation that's not led by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but seeks to work more effectively with, then how can you apply this to yourself? So think about it in terms of, sure, guidance from elders or traditional knowledge holders, but what's the equivalent? Who are the knowledge holders for your focus of your organisation? Is there more that you can be doing in that area? Are there examples where the community's values, relationships and priorities are embedded in the organisation's governance model? This is, of course, framed for mob organisations, but can be applied much more broadly when you really think about it. What are the priorities of your community? If you live in a regional area, what are the priorities of that region? If I think about some of my colleagues in the Pacific, a lot of speak about climate action because that is such a priority in this part of the world. That's a broad example. What's relevant to you in your region, and how do you seek input? We're talking here about being culturally legitimate, but how do you be legitimate in general in understanding the priorities of the stakeholders that you exist for? We can apply this also to accountability, and again framed for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations. Are there Indigenous people in leadership positions? Does the organisation encourage community participation? How? Does the organisation have a clear code of ethics or conduct that aligns with Aboriginal cultural values and principles? Does the organisation act on feedback even when it's uncomfortable? These are ways that you can consider if your organisation is accountable to the community that it serves. Now, of course, we're really dealing in for-purpose organisations in the way that I'm speaking, but if you are a organisation that is not necessarily in the for-purpose space or in the charity space, and you're seeking to work via a reconciliation action plan or an Indigenous strategy of some kind, you can still apply these questions to your practice and take on these principles into the way that you work. It creates better partnerships, but as I mentioned before, it's also more broadly about creating a governance model in Australia that we can all be proud of and benefit from. Think of it also in the terms of evolving and, thinking about things like, I was recently with an organisation who had a program in place, a new organisation that was doing youth programs. They then built their stability doing very well, and then went, hang on a minute, we could also work with early years as well. So added a component to that organisation. What they then did, they evolved their model again, evolved the way that they organise themselves toward that shared goal, the organisation's purpose, but they evolved by writing into their policy that a position in the board would always be reserved for somebody with industry knowledge of early years, somebody who had worked in that industry or knew that industry well. So it's a simple way of evolving the governance model to ensure that that it adapts to change if there's something that's changed for the members, the community, or the nation's priorities, or the way that they do things. Here are some questions that we do that we use in workshop mode that you could ask yourself for your context. Does the organisation have a strategic plan that outlines its goals for the future? Does the organisation review and update its policies and procedures to ensure they're aligned with current best practice and community needs? Has your organisation determined when it's time to make changes to its governance model? These are ways that you can consider for your context how you are able to evolve your governance model. And then we talked about being customised as well. Are there ways that your model is customised for the specific purpose of the organisation and the resources that you have? And there are some questions there. How's your organisation's governance model been customised to regularly engage with community members to ensure that the needs are being met? Are there established partnerships or collaborations that support the goals of the organisation? Particularly in our context at AIGI, we're a small organisation, 10 staff, small organisation. We know the importance of partnering with, we're building partnerships with the Australian Institute of Company Directors, with the Governance Institute of Australia. We're building our relationship, of course, also with the Office of the Registrar of Indigenous Corporations. Partnership is very important to achieving what we care about and serving the communities that we care about at AIGI. So thinking about how that can apply to you. I'm now noting the time, and I've spoken to you for a little while. I wanted to share some takeaways and then use the rest of our time, if I can, to look at that question tab. I see a couple that have come up there already. I've still got it on the chat. I'll move over to the questions in a moment, but wanted to share these takeaways and then we'll have a look at the questions together. Indigenous governance is engaged and stakeholder responsive governance. These principles are helpful when applied more broadly, not just as the baseline for working with Indigenous groups. The conversation's not how do we help, but how do we work together to transform systems that are better for everyone. And to reiterate this point around effective Indigenous governance as an act of disruption, self-determination, and an act of disruption to force Western models to adapt, to listen, to work more effectively with us, because there is so much that Western models can learn from Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing. I'm going to stop talking there at a neat 48 minutes in. And look, I haven't seen lots and lots of comments to tell me that my internet's failed. So I'm thankful that we've made it this far. I was a little bit worried, when I booked this, when I said to the mob at Better Boards, yeah, I'd love to do that. This trip hadn't been planned, and I didn't want to say no to either thing. So, here we are trying to be a dynamic woman in leadership. But look, seems like we've gone okay. I haven't seen messages to say it's not been good. So good news. I see a question here, and Kelly, I don't know if you want to manage the questions or if you just want me to yarn away to what I read there. Up to you.
Jess, there's just a question from John asking, is it okay if he shares this webinar with, or the presentation, with people outside of the Better Boards community?
Yeah, no worries. I think you get a copy of this. we are really keen to tell the story of success of Indigenous governance and these principles in place. If you know really effective organisations as well, encourage them to look into the Indigenous Governance Awards program. There's lots of great opportunities. Look up the toolkit, lots of things on there. So we're really happy to share that story more broadly. And everything I've told you really can be found publicly on the toolkit anyway. I've just organised it in a particular way for today's yarn. So absolutely more than welcome.
Okay, thank you. We haven't got any other questions at this point. We've still got 10 minutes left. So if those that on the call have any more questions, please get typing now so we have enough time to answer them. In the meantime, while we're waiting for questions, I might just distribute the feedback form and the presentation, and that'll give you a few more minutes to get typing.
I really appreciate the takeaway about how do we work together rather than how do we help. Can you give more examples of this? Yeah, I think a good example of this is organisations learning the priorities of I wish I could now, what I could do, Liza, is if you were one of the people that told me, if I go back to the chat, hear me thinking out loud, if I was really onto it, I could see if you said which organisation you're from and be a bit more specific to you. But perhaps I'm not. Oh, no, hang on. Here we go. Independent Director, Red Lily Health Board. Awesome. Okay. Yeah, I think in that context, the example that I would share is learning about the organisation, the Indigenous organisation that you're working with and what matters to them as the starting point. You know, we often go in, and when I say we, I mean we as in the bigger, broader system, whether it's government or philanthropists. Those guys often go in with, these are the parameters that we can work with you. How do you fit into this? I think the challenge for the broader system is working out how to start sooner. I'm on the board, on the RAP committee for GHD, which is a planning organisation in engineering. And what we're trying to do in shifting the way that they work there is to start by learning what matters to that organisation that they might wish to partner with first, so that it's not simply about how to help, but it's about how can we build something together. That's a pretty, I suppose, a corporate RAP example. Let me have a look at the other questions, and I'll keep thinking and maybe loop back around to that if I can think of a better story to tell you, Liza. John, Liza, Emma. Yeah, Emma, that's a really, really interesting question. I'm just going to read it back out. And sorry, Kelly, I'm stepping in and out of the role that you wanted to play, but I'm comfortable doing it, so no stress.
No, that's all good.
This question from Emma is, I sit on 2 non-Indigenous boards. We are looking at whether work closer with someone like the Aboriginal Legal Service as an ally organisation or bring more Aboriginal talent within our organisation. We don't want to be a talent drain. Yeah, it's a really, really good question. It's a really good question. And also really important to remember that we're 3% of the population, and we need to build strong allies and ally organisations, because the work that needs to be done, it's not just for, there simply aren't enough of us to be on every board in every, I often struggle with this in that I worked for a long time with Career Track as an internship program, really successful organisation, and we worked with many corporates, Westpac, Commonwealth Bank, all the big banks, all the big law firms, big construction companies, and they were sometimes really guilty of having employment targets. But in fact, I really worried then about the alumni of the Career Trackers program, because what it could mean over decades is that you have folks who have not built really strong careers and accessed that jump to leadership positions to have a bigger influence because they've been potentially, tantalized by 5% down the road, and you have this, solve that person's employment target, then the same community jumps over here and bounces around corporate Australia too quickly, and I worried about that for a long time. So it is a big point around the talent drain and that cultural load as well. I think that the answer is not simple. I think that you need to try and do both. And I think that while trying to do both, you need to be really thoughtful about how you build capability with those internally, without burdening them with too much cultural load that those individuals aren't able to take on, and you sort of create burnout or impact the employee satisfaction. I think that the answer is a mix of many different strategies. Now I see some new chats, so I'm going back there. Oh, here's the presentation. Oh, that's you, Kelly. Very good.
That was me, and I'm just going to push out the feedback form now, just while we're still waiting for any other questions to come in. It'll come up as a call to action that you can just click on and minimize if you're about to ask another question.
And absolutely, you can reach out. You can write me an email. And I'm, as I mentioned before, I am slowly returning from a bit of parental leave. So I'm only dipping into some important matters for the governance of this organisation, some important partnership stuff, some of this sort of advocacy stuff. I'm only dipping into a handful of things until August. But the wonderful Colette, who's my EA, will find any email that comes through and give it to our learning and development team. So welcome to email me or to put an inquiry through the website. It'll make it to the right person. But to just have some patience if Colette doesn't pass you on immediately, in that I'm not back fully until August.
Okay, we have another question for you, Jess, from William.
Yeah. Yeah, it can be really tricky. And the point that I'll make, sorry, I didn't read it out. I want to ask about when boards in remote communities are dealing with very difficult living situations and how to keep board members accountable to the specific requirements of good governance. People wanting vehicle access and conflicts of interest can be very difficult to deal with. The point that I would make about conflict of interest is that it is a concept and a term that has a lot of negativity and fear around it. I've found that when we're in communities delivering professional development, the first job is to really unpack it and help the group to understand what it means. And sometimes there can be a perceived conflict of interest that's not really a conflict of interest. It might be an example of that the organisation's received some funding to build something, and somebody on the board has a sibling who runs a construction company and can build that thing. Just an example I've made up. And that is a perceived conflict. But if the organisation runs a process and documents that process in the meeting minutes of the organisation, then formally you've followed the right process. When we talk about a conflict of interest where you've got people who are doing the wrong thing, I think that the only way to manage that is through education and learning and helping the group to stick together and to the board to stick together and to understand that if we don't observe our legal duties, we can, and that legal duty in particular is not to put personal interests ahead of the organisation. That's the way conflict of interest is addressed in the Acts. That legal duty is, if we don't observe our legal duties, the consequences are severe, in terms of administration or just simply loss of reputation and endorsement from the community. I think that the broad answer, and I don't want to give you a really soft useless answer. I know that I can hear how challenging it is in the way that that's written. Ultimately the only answer is broad community education around effective governance and to understand and have compassion for the people who are on the board, in that they must observe their legal duties, because the consequences are really severe.
Thanks, Jess. It looks like we're right on time. And I'll just double check we don't have any. Oh, we've got one more question from Tracy. Quick one, Tracy. She's interested in exploring more about how to manage or mitigate cultural load. This is a real issue for non-Indigenous organisations.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting. The RAP committee I'm on, a big conversation about this as well. I think we have to have the conversation and understand for those employees what their interests and boundaries are. Many of us will say, hey, I just want to be a lawyer. I don't want to be on the RAP committee. Or, hey, I just want to be an engineer. I don't want to speak at NAIDOC Week. And that's okay. But we don't know that as non-Indigenous organisations and non-Indigenous staff. You won't know that unless you have the conversation. I think it's really important to put something in place in policy as well, and have that something that is really important and that the board talk about. Some organisations now are talking about, and again with funding and resourcing, I get this isn't applicable yet in every case, but we've got to value Indigenous property, Indigenous intellectual property, and cultural intellectual property. But some organisations are now talking about how you address this in remuneration, an additional stipend that you can opt in for. So if you are, a lawyer and you do want to speak at NAIDOC Week and you do want to be on the committee and you are happy for the phone call that says, how do I deal with this? You can opt into that and have that added to your remuneration package. There are things that I'm seeing emerge that are really important in this conversation. But as a really sort of general answer, I would say, how do you manage it? Understand what the individual is interested in, and build build something more broad into the policies of the organisation, so that good work you do exists after you.
Have we got time for one more quick one?
Sure, yeah, I've got time.
Okay, Taffy has one. How do you diffuse the potential tensions between the two different ways of governance? This will be our last question, guys.
How do you diffuse tensions? They'll always be there. They'll always be there. This work that we are doing in order to educate and really tell the story of how Western models can learn from Indigenous models, that's part of the work. But diffusing the tension is a tricky question, because it's always going to be there. It's going to be there for a very long time. We have to acknowledge it. We have to sit in that discomfort. We have to build the momentum so that when we push back as Indigenous people on non-Indigenous boards, for example, or in partnerships, and we push back and we say, hey, you can do some of that cultural awareness education yourself and then come to me for the conversation. I don't need to do that bit of cultural awareness training in every board meeting. We're at a point where I expect a little bit more education from you. When we build that momentum and we push back and we do that work, that leads us towards being able to deal with those tensions more. But they'll always be there. They'll always be uncomfortable. We have to acknowledge the discomfort and face it head on and work out how to use it to our advantage in any situation.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jessica. And that wraps up our webinar for today. So thank you everybody on the call. And we've got lots of thank yous coming in for you, Jess. So cool. Thank you again for joining us on your little Fijian work / new mum / mum of 5-year-old experience. And congratulations that we didn't have any babies crying in the background. So
Oh
your
no,
hubby's
he's
obviously off on a walk somewhere with the kids.
that's exactly right. Yep, that's
Oh,
exactly right.
so just when you thought you were having a break, you had to spend an hour with us. Oh well.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's a real pleasure. It's a real pleasure, and I'm not back in Canberra until Sunday, so I've now got a little bit of time to go and do some things. But you know,
Oh
it's
yes, you better get your woolies out if you're going back to Canberra. It's pretty
I
cold.
know. Tell me about it. No, but it's really lovely to have the opportunity, thanks to the Mob at Better Boards, to share AIGI's story and work, and I'm really pleased to meet a few new friends here in the chat, and yeah, looking forward to connecting more. Thanks again.
Excellent. Thank you so much, and you guys all have a good weekend. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye. Kelly, do you want me to just press hang up, or do you want to talk to me? I don't know. I'm good to go as well, I suppose.